Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Gospel of Galactus. I'm your host, Kane, and today we're going to get into a little bit more of my background and how things kind of got to where they were, and so on and so forth. So, I mentioned how I'd had the evangelical upbringing, but I didn't quite get into what that meant. My grandmother and grandfather got custody of my mother at around 3. Now, my grandmother was originally married to a dude named John Allen Webb, who actually is my mom's father. She later remarried to a man named Richard that sort of became my dad. So you might hear me interchangeably refer to these people as dad or grandfather, and it can get a little bit confusing. I try to stay cognizant of that. But my family was very weird and insisted that I call my grandmother mom, which then made my grandfather father, and my grandma wanted me to actually call my mom my sister. We'll get into that. So anyway, after my grandma got custody, she decided that the best thing for me would be to be put into private school. My grandma grew up in Texas. Even though my grandfather was in the Navy and served at the White House as John F. Kennedy's telecommunications chief and Lyndon Baines Johnson's telecommunications chief, my family, at least my grandma, were staunch Republicans grown up in Texas, very, very conservative, had that lifestyle. So when my grandmother moved out to California, she isolated herself within as many evangelical conservative communities as she possibly could. And so when she gained custody of me, it completely then made sense for her to give me that same sort of cocoon. So I was first sent to Nazarene Christian School, which is in Whittier. And I stayed there until my grandfather, Richard, passed away, because John, he was, boy, we'll get into John later, but John doesn't really play a role in my life, at least a featuring role. He plays an important background role because of what he did ultimately to my mother and my grandmother. He was a very abusive man, even though he was high ranking in the White House and had a lot of authority. In fact, my cousin, uncle, I guess it would be my uncle, Johnny, who's not alive, he died very, very young. I think he died at 19. But he had cerebral palsy. And back then, in like the 50s and 60s, they didn't really know what was going on with that. He was having a lot of seizures. They were trying to get diagnoses, and grandma, had taken him to so many different doctors, and they told her, oh, these are just seizures, you don't need to be worried. She knew something was wrong, and so she insisted to my grandfather, who then talked to John Kennedy. And Kennedy had my grandmother actually take Johnny to see his doctor in Bethesda, who then diagnosed him with cerebral palsy. And I guess the last time my mom had heard from the doctor who had misdiagnosed him, he wasn't even at that hospital anymore. He'd since been shuttled along. But anyway, he was a very powerful man, but he was also a very abusive man. He beat my grandmother quite viciously, and I suppose I should throw out some trigger warnings here for people who weren't expecting this be necessary. But yeah, he beat my grandmother, and he did really unspeakable things to my mother as a child. And we'll leave it at that. I'm sure you can figure out what those things were. If you need some help, Jared from Subway is probably a good example. Jeffrey Epstein's probably another example. So anyway, my mom Grandma, I will never get rid of that, even though no matter how hard I try. My grandma grabs my actual mom and moves her to California. Now, her son, Robert, my uncle, decides to stay with his dad because he's already going into the Navy and is going to do his own thing. So he also really wasn't on the receiving end of a lot of this abuse because he was a male. So, he made up his own mind. He lived his own life. That's fine. But my grandmother, after she moved to California, just instantly went into this cocoon, which, I mean, I can kind of get after going through a situation like that. But then she started to raise me inside that. So, from Nazarene Christian School, after my grandfather, Richard, died on Halloween when I was 8, it was really, really hard. And at the time, I didn't fully understand why things were the way they were and what exactly was going on, why we were moving a lot, changing around a lot. And I thought it was weird, but I later found out that's because my grandma wasn't exactly a faithful woman. And all of this stuff kind of came to the surface after he had died. I thought there was this dude in my life named Uncle Frank who was always really cool and whatnot. My grandma would even have me talk to this dude. But yeah, they were Sancho and Sanchez. And anyway. So my grandma puts me in Nazarene Christian school, and then after that, we move over to Grace Christian, which is kind of like right by, like I mentioned in the last video, the racetrack. And the entire time, we had been going with my grandfather Richard, to Cypress Evangelical Free Church. In fact, I think Richard's Bible is still the feature Bible there. I have no idea. I don't exactly go to that church. But I know when I was very, very young, too young to understand, Mary and them would have me out there doing the anti-abortion things that they're doing now, the signs. And she would always tell me, well, you don't want them killing babies, do you? A very reductionist argument to this whole thing. And so she would manipulate me to take part in these very conservative minded protests, even when I was very young and had no say in the matter. I had to go out there, I had to hold signs. And the funniest thing is I still remember later on in life, this woman who said never get abortions told me to tell my girlfriends to get them because she didn't want me having kids too young. Go figure, right? Well, anyways, after Richard dies, she marries this other dude named James. She cheats on him, too, and he leaves her because he ain't about that life. And, of course, she makes me think it's his fault, but I, later find out the truth. Anyways, around that time, James just tells everyone in the church who this woman is, and Mary is pretty much forced to leave. So we not only move from Cyprus completely out of my life, we moved from Cyprus to La Palma, and then from La Palma to Irvine, California. And that's when she dumps me into South Coast Community Church at the time. Now, the pastor there was Bob Shank. And somewhere around like 4 to 5 years after we were there, the church it merged with Mariners in Costa Mesa, Newport Beach, and it became a huge mega church in South Orange County. And as a result, they tended to go more towards a more liberal leaning outlook. And Mary, of course, couldn't stand this, so she had to leave and find a new church. Because she eventually tried a couple of new churches and then came back and just did her singles groups there, but it was never really the same. And that's kind of about when her and I she put me into homes, into group homes, into Orangewood, into Provo Canyon School, into New Haven and San Diego. Let's see, College Hospital, Costa Mesa, and the Linden Center. Let's not forget them, the good old Linden Center. So Mary basically, at the time that I became a teenager and she was getting towards the last part of her physically active years, decided that it was important for her to have sex with as many men as humanly possible while leaving me to fend for myself. And one of those nights eventually included me calling her on the phone, telling her that I was pretty sure there was somebody in the house with me, and it sounded like they were sharpening a knife. And I'm more to the point, I said, I'm pretty sure they're in my closet. Mary not only admonished me and called me crazy and just trying to ruin her night, she told me not to call her again. So she comes home that night, and I had already moved into her room because I was scared. I'm a kid and I hear noises. I don't like this. I go in her room. I had fallen asleep watching a movie. She comes home, and I'm awakened to the sound of her turning out the light, but I happen to look down at the foot of the bed, and of course, the dude that I'd said was in the house with us in the house with me the entire night popped up and then tried to kill both my grandma and I. Maybe someday I'll tell the full story. It's not really something I try and hide from. I actually think I was kind of a badass in that scenario for being as young as I was. But yeah, nonetheless, I turned out to be right. He was a gang member who his initiation was to kill two people, me and her. So yeah, I mean, this kind of gives you the idea of who my evangelical mother was, how I got shuttled into this background. But also around this time too, the one thing that Mary did that kind of makes this thing come all full circle was during the course of being with my grandpa John when he was in the military and eventually then stationed in the White House, she had done a lot of world traveling, and her favorite place on the planet was, of course, Greece. There were, Greek hummels, statues, plates, figurines, just all sorts of nice Greek stuff that she had purchased over the years and imported to put up on the walls and stuff. Her favorite building in the history of the world was the Parthenon, and she just absolutely loved Greek culture, Greek heritage, Greek food. And as a result, as evangelical as my mother was, you played games growing up, your video games. I got some that I guarantee you didn't play. Well, actually, if you're watching this channel and you're a former Christian, maybe you did play them, but I can't wait to get into this in about a week or two. My grandma was very, very, very hawkish over what I was able to read, write, watch, learn, all that sorts of stuff. But the one thing she didn't mind because she loved Greece so much were comics. She let me read stories about superheroes and pick up comics freely because, in her mind, they weren't really any different than, and they're not. The story of the Greek gods and the Greek heroes. So to her, it was just one and the same. And that may have been the worst idea if she wanted to keep me an evangelical, but I don't know. We may have to explore that in a different episode. But anyway, getting back to the point, she allowed me to read a lot of comics and absorb a lot of comics simply because she kind of thought they were just an extension of that. We're not Greek, we're Dutch. We grew up Dutch. We went to the Dutch bakery. We spoke Dutch. Not just a coincidence. So it was weird to have this Greek emphasis in our house, but it eventually became a refuge for me in the form of comics and led to my love of mythology, religion, and trying to understand the fundamentals of why we're here and what it's all about, or at least our best human guesses as posited by people throughout the ages. That's sort of what initially drew me into these subjects and made them a little bit more palatable for me. If you're going from the idea of guys like Kukulkan, who, is now called Namor, or you have the Sky Fathers like Odin, Zeus, Thor, things of that nature in Marvel Comics, it is really not a stretch to then go from there into actually learning about the basis for these characters and whence they came. So I think that that also expanded my thirst for knowledge on ancient religions and understanding and questioning biblical and religious texts very early on. I remember I just had a lot of problems with it and trying to grasp it and understand it, and it wasn't for lack of trying, as I'm sure down the line someone will eventually grab this video if I ever gain any kind of following like I have on Twitter. They'll post these clips and they'll say you were never a true Christian. They won't include this segment, but they'll post the others. So anyway, to sort of wrap this thing up and to move ahead, it is all of this that then got me into comics and sort of created the seeds that would eventually become this channel down the line, where I intend to explore religion, mythology, and my own upbringing in an evangelical lifestyle through the lens of comics as American mythology. Next week's video is specifically going to focus on, and I realize these past couple of videos have just been me kind of sitting in front of a camera with backgrounds and stuff. I felt it was important to not really have a lot of visuals in telling my own story, especially because I was going to be talking about some pretty personal things, and I just wanted it to be from me to other people. But going forward, I do intend to fully include the normal accoutrement that you're used to seeing in YouTube videos, clips, fun look backs, graphs, all that stuff that you can expect. And starting next week, I'm going to be looking at how comics led to my love. Excuse me. How comics led to my love of mythology and eventually created the basis for what I use as my own personal ethos going forward. So, if you've never explored the idea of Marvel and DC really being as important as Roman gods, Greek gods, Mesopotamian gods, that's what I'm here for, because American mythology, our mythology, that which we have created in the United States, superheroes are, whether people like it or not, are the defining aspect of American mythology. You cannot talk about real American mythology without addressing superheroes. And the cool thing about it is that it draws on so many old legends that it's not just me trying to shoehorn it into mythology. It's actual, real mythology. And one day it will be studied as such. And I'm kind of excited for that. It won't be in my lifetime, but one day people will look back and they'll be like, hey, the Empire of America, what were their gods? Galactus, Thanos, Superman, Batman. These are the things that are going to be talked about. And I think it's really, really cool. And I also think that comics as American mythology is a completely underserved community on YouTube. There are mythology channels, there are comic channels. You can find everything you want about both of those topics through a variety of different people that I will inevitably be referring to, hopefully talking to, and using footage from. But I really don't see a lot of people focusing on the importance of the comic heroes in American mythology and how one day it will help shape a future civilization's understanding of what we held valuable on the entertainment and God side. So That's the entire purpose of Gospel of Galactus. That's what this is for. It's an exploration of my past, sure, but it's also an exploration of everything that I love about American mythology. And I do hope that you'll stick around, subscribe, tell your friends. I'm not even in the position of trying to ask for donations or anything like that. This is me getting off the ground. I will talk about that crap way down the line when I have established an effective and energetic base. But for right now, the best thing you can do is just ask questions, like, leave a comment, and subscribe. As always, I am Kane. This is Gospel of Galactus. We'll catch you guys next time.